National Review, and I'm joined here by a very distinguished group of people who are all very sensible, but I'm hoping to provoke them and prod them into just savagely attacking one another, purely for your entertainment, because that's what we're here for. Well, there's always that. There's always that. Personal attacks on the moderator, however, will be met with the most extreme measures. Alex Cooley is with a very mysterious-sounding organization called Solstice. He is a grower. He is a Pied Piper of cannabis in Washington State, among many other things. Keith Humphreys is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. Dan Riffle is somewhat oddly described here as a former marijuana lobbyist. Thankfully, he wears many other hats, but I have been sworn to secrecy about them. Perhaps he'll tell you about them later on. Steve Rolls is a senior policy analyst at the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. A senior policy analyst is not to be confused for a junior policy analyst.
There's only one at the organization.
So thank you everyone for joining me. I wanted to get right into the question. So we're discussing regimes of legal access. Because of course, we are far along in a real sea change in how people are thinking about the regulation of cannabis. And in the United States, at least, we've moved in this kind of headlong rush towards lots of kind of jury-rigged, funky, inconsistent regimes at the state and local level that look really, really different. And of course, globally, we've seen a variety of different models emerging as to how to regulate cannabis markets. So just to get us started, Steve, you've had some experience in countries that are not the United States. I kind of sometimes barely remember that such other countries exist, but apparently they do. And you've done some work in the UK, and you've also done some work in Uruguay. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how the so-called Uruguay model first emerged and your involvement in it.
Yeah, well, the Uruguay model is very interesting. It was the first national model. In fact, it's currently the only national model. Obviously, the US is at state level. This is at nation-state level. Canada is now following, but they obviously haven't decided what they're going to do yet. It's just theoretical. But Uruguay, I think there was an interesting political contrast in how it came about compared to the US, because the US were essentially ballot initiative driven. They were effectively activist driven. They weren't driven by legislatures. And they had a popular mandate, and they were driven by they were designed by effectively by non-government organisations. That's a fair summary. In contrast, in Uruguay there wasn't a popular mandate. There wasn't a majority in support of moving towards legal regulation.
Did that partly reflect the fact that cannabis consumption levels were pretty modest in Uruguay?
They were modest compared to the US, but they're quite high compared to the rest of Latin America. It was interesting that it was driven by the government. I mean, there is an activist movement in Uruguay, and there was actually two conflicting bills. So there was an activist-driven bill, which was about decriminalisation and home cultivation and social clubs, and then there was the government that wanted to establish effectively a sort of very strictly regulated, almost a state monopoly. And what eventually ended up happening is that the two were combined. So there is a state monopoly effect. Well, it's not exactly a state monopoly, but the state is the sole buyer from licensed commercial entities, and the state is then the sole provider to retail outlets, which are all licensed pharmacies. And you have to be a license. You have to get a license to buy the cannabis. So it's a very regulated system, perhaps over-regulated. In some respects, actually more regulated than we advise. I mean, they did most of the things that we suggested, but I think, perhaps over-regulated with the licensed user access model. But that was actually reflected the political dynamic in that they are a small country between two Latin giants, Argentina and Brazil. Argentina and Brazil were very worried about diversion, tourism. And so the licensed user thing was adults with a Uruguayan passport, basically, to restrict the tourism issue. I suspect it's not going to work very well and will be relaxed or abolished fairly quickly. But it was, to get over the finishing line, they probably advocated a more restrictive and intrusive model than they needed to. But it's effectively a non-commercial model. It will be non-branded products. It's herbal cannabis only. The only products that are for sale are licensed by the government, so you can't have, they won't sell edibles or concentrates or anything like that. The price is determined by the government. There's no advertising or marketing. So, I mean, in many ways, it's a kind of non-commercial way of meeting demand through a legal system, but trying to avoid any of the incentives for any of the commercial pressure to increase use.
One thing I find striking about your story is that, you know, the title for a panel is Designing Regimes for Legal Access, yet what you're telling us is that, in a way, the regime in Uruguay was not really designed. It was actually kind of two separate ideas that were kind of brought together in a way that you're telling us was a little bit imperfect. That sounds like a theme we're going to see with regard to other regimes of legal access, but is that a fair characterization of it?
Sort of, in that it was a compromise between the two, but I think it was a sensible compromise in that they also allowing licensed cannabis social clubs rather than the Spanish social club model, and they're also allowing home growing in a similar vein to the US state model.
So you see some coherence. I mean, there is kind of
it's very
coherence
clear.
between
And I think they proceeded in a very responsible way. They had a series of consultations with experts from around the world, and medical experts, and policy experts, and reform advocates, and they have taken their time. I mean, this was passed in late 2013, and the shops haven't opened yet. The shops are only opening in a few months' time, so they've taken their time, and maybe a little bit longer than most people would hope, but they've proceeded in a very methodical, I think, rational fashion. They determined what the key policy aims were going to be. That they wanted to pursue. It was very much public health led. They identified what they saw as the key risks of over-commercialisation and failing to learn the lessons from alcohol and tobacco, and they designed a model to respond to that. So I think they've gone about it in a very sensible way, and they've come up with a sensible model that's perhaps a bit over-regulated, but will nonetheless be a useful contrast in terms of providing evidence compared to the more commercial models.
So speaking of useful contrasts, I mean, Alex, you are operating in Washington State, where I think it's fair to say that the regime that you're operating under as an entrepreneur is not necessarily as thoughtful, as coherent, not as top-down, and what have you. This was a product of an initiative. And I kind of wonder for you, as an entrepreneur operating in this new emerging legal regime, just if you could tell us a little bit about your experiences, and also about how this, my sense is that the regime in Washington State, and you can elaborate on this, is actually kind of evolving all the time. So you had to operate in this market, when it looked very different than it does now, and you don't necessarily have a clear sense of what it's likely to look like, let's say 3-4 years from now.
Yeah, so it's definitely been an emerging process.
Tell us a little bit first about how you got started, what the regime looked like when you got started.
So when I got started, I'm actually really grateful. I think it was, at least we're within a couple days, 10 years ago, I grew my first cannabis plant. And I grew my first cannabis plant in a closet in a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle. So I started very, very small. I did it as a hobby while I was going to school to be an educator. And somehow I got myself caught up in a wave that has been growing and growing ever since. And I've gone through, I'd say, kind of all stages of what a cannabis cultivator is and does. Uniquely enough, very grateful to have done so. So a couple plants, one light closet, to then becoming a care provider. I was a respite care provider for children with disabilities at that time as well, so it kind of opened me into that world. So individual care provider, then care provider for multiple persons, and then helping other people become care providers. And this is before Washington State even had a plant limit. We've been incredibly ambiguous in Washington. We started with what was known as a 60-day supply, and that's what actually came out of our 1998 initiative for medical cannabis. And then it was in 2006, I believe, the Department of Health was tasked with defining what was a 60-day supply, and they came out and determined that 24 ounces of usable cannabis and 15 plants was a 60-day supply, which was the highest in the nation. Absolutely a lot. But of course, you have people who have higher demands than that. So it's without having any, prescriptive authority by physicians. It's really kind of it's a crapshoot whether you pick a low number or a high number. And then from there, I started a few companies, and it was very, very brand new to have companies for this. In 2008, I actually originally was moving to California once Seattle Public Schools went on a hiring freeze, and I never got a teaching job. And then I decided to stay in Washington State, and things continued to grow and climb. We had a really, really amazing bill. It was Senate Bill 5073. It's probably the only bill number I can remember anymore. That was written in 2010, went through our 2011 legislature, which was intended to essentially kind of commercialize the industry in the same fashion that Colorado did in 2010. We passed that initiative, or that bill through our House and Senate, and our former governor sectionally vetoed it, and we were left with very small pieces of the original bill. And that was kind of the first semblance of commercialization in Washington State. Oddly enough, my companies then, and Solstice, its first incarnation, because we started Solstice in 2011, it was a Chapter 23 miscellaneous nonprofit. So we actually went the nonprofit model, not because we were required to, but we looked to the most developed marketplace at that point, which was California, which was forced to be nonprofit through SB 420.
So this was anticipating the future shape of the legal regime and wanting to get on the right side.
Yeah, we assumed it was going to go that direction, but we very intentionally became a miscellaneous nonprofit in order to, if it went a different direction, go that direction. It was honestly, it was for protection. A lot of the decisions many of us made previous to 2012 were in an attempt to, not look appetizing to the federal government. So once Initiative 502 passed in 2012, then we changed everything over into, I believe we're a C corporation now. I really don't know, because I really don't care. I don't like it. It's very interesting how legalization, and it's an internal conflict and conversation I have often, and it was very interesting to hear Jonathan Calkins' perspective on it earlier. Of that's really the model, and truthfully, it's because that's the model of the United States.
Just a very quick answer, a quick question. Has this created lots of anxiety for you and your partners in the business? I mean, just the uncertainty around the legal regime.
No. From the beginning of my story to now, my anxiety and uncertainty and inability to sleep has greatly declined. I sleep very well. I don't worry too much anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not afraid of going to prison anymore. I don't think the likelihood of getting a death penalty conviction or sentence under a RICO case, I think that's even smaller of a likelihood. So I'm not worried about it. I am frustrated of the capitalist system I engage with, because that's the business. That's what we do. We are corporate capitalism, consumer driven, and that makes you behave in a certain way in order to participate in the marketplace. My goal has always been just to grow cannabis. Like, I love growing cannabis, but how legalization has unfolded not only in our nation but across the world, because we're a very capitalist world. That's what comes. Now there are positives to definitely recognize associated with that. If we were a nonprofit for state like California is soon to be said used to be, because California is now going for profit with their new medical laws.
Well, we're going to get into that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Without the for-profit capability, the investment is not there. So what has put a complete shot in the arm, and you've seen it first in Colorado and then second in Washington State, is the amount of investment that has come in is incredibly substantial, to say the least.
Definitely going to get into that.
And that has really evolved the legalization effort. That's evolved the technologies, that's evolved the business, that's evolved the medical utility. I think we're making better medical utility focused products now. And that's kind of the way it's going to roll forward, in my opinion.
So Keith, you are from California, and California is kind of the capital in the Western world California has played an incredibly important and central role in the kind of the big sea change in attitudes and also the legal treatment of cannabis. And I wonder about your thoughts. Steve earlier on was talking about how, in Uruguay, you essentially had a kind of top-down approach. You had people who were coming into power who had a vision of a kind of more enlightened approach to cannabis. But then in the United States, you kind of have basically a grassroots mobilization that's, taken this a variety of different forms. So I kind of wonder your thoughts on that, top-down approach versus this more grassroots approach happening through initiatives.
So my involvement in this in California came through something called the Blue Ribbon Commission on Marijuana Policy, which anyone can see online, safeandsmartpolicy.org, which was chaired by our Lieutenant Governor, Gavin Newsom, which in itself shows you that California is unusual because he is the highest ranking official in the country to say, I'm for this. But fortunately, his orientation, the Commission's orientation wasn't, we're for this at all costs, but we want to think about how to do this intelligently because anyone who has been around policy knows you can make anything worse, no matter what it is. So that was in some sense you could say it was, quote, an elite process in that there were sort of leaders of many of the organizations and policy experts and judges and police and all that who participated on the commission, but it was also very grassroots in that we went around the state from top to bottom talking to, anyone who wanted to talk to us at public forums and that sort of thing. And that was very interesting to sort of see the diverse perspectives on this issue, from terrible fear to great anticipation. And the fears among the grassroots are not always as predictable as you might think. I was struck like in Oakland, a lot of the fear was that this will become an all-white industry and black people will be shut out of it, and so they'll still be dealing in our neighborhoods, we'll still be getting arrested, and white people will be making money. Up in the growing country, the Humboldt County, people who've been growing, some of them learned from their parents and from their parents before them. It really is sort of sounding very much like small family farmers you might see in a discussion of corn subsidies. Are excited but also terrified that they'll be wiped out by a big corporate entity because one massive farm in the Central Valley could supply all the pot California needs, and they want to have an industry that lets them participate in some way. So all that's pulled together in the commission report, these sort of recommendations of sort of trying to do justice to the different things people said, certainly not ordering anybody what to do, we're not kings, but saying, we should think about things like, what about equity for these groups that have been harmed, and how do you bring them out of the cold, bring them into an industry where they can behave and be good actors and make a living and get jobs and those sorts of things. How do you protect these small, mom and pop kind of businesses and not have them all wiped out? And then how do you not have the regulatory system captured by a megacorp? So that's what's in the commission, and I'm happy to say that something like 18 different initiatives were filed in California, but many of them took pieces out of that commission and put it in there. So that we were all very pleased with that.
Dan, your perspective on the structure that marijuana markets ought to take has changed. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, just your initial perspective on these issues, and also why that initial perspective, why you moved from one position to another.
Sure, and just a quick disclaimer, so for the rather shadowy title of former marijuana lobbyist, that's because I actually work in the U.S. House of Representatives, but I don't want to give people the impression, I can't give people the impression that I'm giving you the government's perspective here for obvious reasons. But I was a lobbyist for a marijuana advocacy organization for many years. And I wouldn't say that my perspective on it changed so much as the circumstances changed. I think I've always felt from the beginning that the smartest way to do this would be through make marijuana legal, but just legal enough to meet demand, not so legal as to increase it, as it was described earlier by Jonathan. Non-commercial, non-profit opportunities, B Corps, all the kind of stuff we saw in Rand's, in the middle of Rand's chart and report. But, in 2009 and 10, when I first started working on this issue, no one really cared about that.
I'm just curious. That I wonder because that's a big decision to kind of make that your life's work, at that point to kind of really devote so much of your time and effort to it. What in particular was that drew you to marijuana advocacy?
Sure. I was a prosecuting attorney in Southeast Ohio, which is the Emerald Triangle of Appalachia. You know, western part of West Virginia, Southeast Ohio, and eastern Kentucky. It's, you know, like I said, the equivalent of Emerald Triangle in California. So we had a lot of marijuana cultivation cases, marijuana trafficking cases. We also had a university in the county next door, so we had a lot of you know, cases of kids driving back and forth on the highways with small amounts of marijuana. And, you know, as a prosecutor, I would spend 2, 3, 4 hours a day handling marijuana cases upstairs in county court and downstairs in common police court. I've got, you know, files with rape, aggravated assault, burglary, real crimes with real victims that pose real public safety threats, and just sort of felt like, for me, for the judges, for the police officers who are working on this, it's just not a good use of law enforcement resources. And to the extent that there are harms associated with marijuana, and there are, it's a drug, it's harmful, there are all sorts of external problems associated with the trade. They're mostly attributable to the fact that it's illegal. A better way to deal with them, instead of arresting and prosecuting people, is to tax it and regulate it. And so that was my view in 2008, 9, and considering, you know, how to go about working on this, or, you know, what to go about doing. The fact that I think, you know, it should be a non-commercial model or a non-profit model was really just not part of the conversation. The conversation at that time was, should marijuana be legal or should it be illegal? And I went to go work for the organization that I did because, you know, this was not a I didn't have a free the weed stoner approach to this issue. It was more of a, what's the smartest policy, what's the most rational policy? This, you know, making marijuana legal makes more sense than prohibition.
When did that conversation start to change, just out of curiosity? So you say, like, you know, as recently as 08, 09, it really was focused on that kind of very black and white question. So I'm curious as to...
Yeah, right around that time. I mean, I think regionally, California has been having this conversation since, you know, the mid-90s. On the East Coast, it's obviously much more recent. I think nationally, 2012, with passage of the Colorado ballot initiative, is when it kind of blew up nationally, which incidentally was about that time that I went from being a state-level lobbyist to a federal-level lobbyist. So the type of work that I was doing went from designing regimes of access in medical marijuana states to talking to, you know, 80-year-old men in Congress about ending marijuana prohibition, which, you know, these are folks who came about in the tough on crime years of the 70s and 80s and the Reagan years of just say no. So, you know, in terms of my change of perspective on this, like I said, I've always had the same perspective. I think it's just the fact that the national conversation changed. And so I went from saying, let's go from illegal to legal, to saying, okay, we're going to legal, how should we go about doing that? And so those sorts of questions of what the model looks like suddenly became a lot more important in 2012 and 13 than they were in 2008, 9, 10.
Steve, your work is not limited to Uruguay. You work in a variety of different countries and you know, a variety of different political, institutional contexts. I'm curious, have you seen a kind of similar evolution in terms of the conversation around marijuana that Dan described having happened in the United States, away from just a simple binary conversation towards one that is just, you know, more around the particularities of how the market ought to be regulated?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that my organisation has done is Transform was that, you know, we identified the fact that there was this debate going on, and there was a very eloquent, and has been for a long time, very sort of eloquent critique of the failings of prohibition and an enforcement-based approach. But there wasn't really an equivalent vision of what an alternative policy would look like. And so we set out from the beginning to try and fill that gap to some extent. So we've written books about you know, how to regulate cannabis. We've written books about how to regulate other drugs, or our vision of what we think that should be like. As a way, you know, I'm sure not everyone's going to agree with what we've done, or and there's more than one way of doing it. But as a way of getting that discussion going, we thought you need to map out what the parameters of that discussion are. How do we regulate production, or transit, or licensing of vendors, or access controls, or age controls, or the products themselves, or the price controls, and all that sort of stuff. You need to burrow into that detail and say, okay, what are your policy priorities, and what will different approaches to each of these elements of market regulation have in terms of outcomes? And so, you know, you draw on the literature from alcohol and tobacco regulation and pharmaceutical regulation, and to a certain extent regulation of other forms of vice like gambling or sex work, and you can start to sort of learn those lessons and build them into new regulation models and inform that discussion. It feels to me like that's where the discussion is now. And obviously, as Dan points out, that discussion really began to accelerate when the actual possibility of legalization regulation started to move from theoretical debate to policy reality. And Colorado was the opening gambit, but now sort of domino-like it's happening all over the place. And so it feels to me like the discussion has moved from if we should legalize to how we should do it best. And that's a very active discussion, and as I said, that we now have, interestingly, almost like a controlled experiment with 4 or 5 different models unfolding around the world that we can learn from, and mistakes will no doubt be made. Maybe Uruguay are over-regulating to some degree, maybe Colorado is under-regulating to some degree. Who knows? I mean, we need to. There's not really enough data to know for sure yet. But as that information emerges, it's going to inform that debate as it progresses in the coming years.
So this raises a really interesting question, actually, and someone from the audience raised this too. So you say that initially, when we have a new regime around regulating the cannabis market, we can't expect it to be perfect. We can't expect it to be optimal. But that actually raises this interesting question. So what do we want our starting point to be, given that? So one view, one intuitive view, is that you actually want it to be as restrictive as possible and to move very tentatively, very slowly, towards reform. Another view is that, look, we should begin with a presumption of individual liberty, a presumption that, the commercial legalization isn't necessarily going to be a disaster. If it is, we can go back and revisit and rethink, because the great evil, of the status quo, some would say, is that we've actually been so inhibiting of choice, initiative, entrepreneurship, etc. So I wonder, Keith, having been on this commission, I kind of wonder what you think about that. What should be our starting point if we recognize that it's going to have to change over time?
Right. So that's a question that does divide people in exactly the way you described it. My view is that it's hard to regulate industries. And I should say that I've worked in the White House. I worked in positions where allegedly I should have had some power with industries. And industries are a pretty impressive bunch, I must say. They very often get their way, particularly in the American system, because the way our political donations work. So my view is that just on my view, I would back this up by saying it's easier to start tight and then relax than go the other way around. And to give you examples, after alcohol prohibition, Missouri put a half-cent per pure gallon of ethanol tax on ethanol, which was a lot in the 30s. It stayed there for 50 years, frozen at a half-cent per gallon. Federal alcohol taxes haven't raised in real terms since 1991, so in other words, they've been dropping. And just try to even propose adjustment for inflation so they don't lose value. And you will see Congress people running away at very high speed. So because of that, I'm someone who would be on the restrictive side, because I just expect corporate regulatory capture to happen. The downside to that potentially gives the illicit market more legs. That is a disadvantage. But I think in the long term, over like a generation, I think we're better off because we can have, corporations can do a lot. There's plenty of very decent people who work in the private sector. It's not bad. But historically, we have had trouble regulating these kinds of industries, and so that would be my view.
I just want to throw something out there for the folks in the audience. I fear that we have a lot of consensus on this panel. So I really urge you guys to ask challenging questions, because I kind of get the sense that we have a lot of people here who are very skeptical of the commercialization of cannabis. And I wonder, for you, Alex, it sounds as though you kind of have a deeper skepticism about market capitalism, period. But I kind of wonder, so if you imagine this starting point, you start very restrictive, you start very tight, one could say that it's hard to imagine a story like yours having unfolded at all, right? Because you kind of blew it open, and actually for kind of a big variety of different producers to kind of get in there, and someone like you, kind of very civic-minded, and very kind of thoughtful about the model that you want to pursue. But I mean, if you went in this other direction, in New York State, for example, Governor Cuomo has proposed this very strange marijuana access regime that I personally don't understand all that well. I imagine the folks on the panel understand it better than I do, in which hospitals would be certified to kind of distribute marijuana. So I kind of wonder, I mean, do you feel as though starting out really tight would have made it impossible for someone like you to have gotten into the business?
So it's a unique question where I get to wear both hats that I wear, which is one, the kind of, not for capitalism, and two, the capitalistic entrepreneur. I am for starting very loose. One, from an industry perspective, because the tighter we are, and I'd say Washington State is the tightest regulated state right now, it's very hard to do business, and just like normal business, where, if I want to do transfers between processor to processor, and I just want to pay them a service fee because they're going to extract a product for me and supply back all the material, they never actually own any of my cannabis, that's not possible. If I want to pay farmers on terms the same way that vintners buy grapes or apples are bought, I can't do that. So that's a very big downside of starting very restrictive, is that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of kind of deregulation actions we need to make. And I keep arguing for deregulation, it makes my soul cry. But we have to, because we have to conduct business, because you're absolutely right, the tighter we are, the stronger the illicit market is. And I think Washington State is a perfect example of an incredibly stronger illicit market as a result of legalization. That's not to say it's anyone's particular fault. That's not to say that the LCB should have done better or this or that. It was a series of events that just put them in a stronger position. We didn't get that medical marijuana law. We had to take a year to bring it online in any fashion. So at that same time, we all worked really hard to normalize cannabis, and so the general populace thought cannabis is okay, so they went and bought it, and it turns out the only supply that they had was the illicit market. And it is a kind of the same statement of, if you're very loose, it's hard to go tighter later. Well, if you allow the illicit market to get its hands really in it, especially in the beginning, it's really hard to take it back from them.
Has that been a challenge?
100%.
Meaning that there's a persistence of this illicit market.
Absolutely.
In a way, you're actually competing with these folks who don't have the same regulatory and tax burdens that you guys are.
100%. And it's a really unique feeling to have and experience to be a part of. That I am talking to, and I've seen him kicking around our city attorney Pete Holmes, having conversations with him, saying we need enforcement, we need to be arresting people, we need to be taking care of this illicit market. It's like, oh my God, where did I come from saying these words? Because now we're in a regulated model, but we gave the illicit market the opportunity to really gain market share. Well, how do we get market share back from them? The easiest is boop.
I want to ask Dan, so Keith earlier on raised this idea that once you have a real industry emerge, it has, it's very difficult to reverse. And one could say it's about campaign contributions. You could also say that you have, employers, and those employers have employees, who are going to be influential, but obviously you have a real industry, you have something that, you have stakes. And I wonder, you talked about how things started out in 08, 09, and how they kind of evolved. I wonder, did you see a kind of emergence of a cannabis industry? And did that emergence wind up shaping the work that you were doing and the work of the larger, movement of folks looking to liberalize these laws?
I think there's always been an industry. It's just a question of whether it was, an illegal industry or a legal industry. I mean, there was a cannabis industry in California in the late 90s and the early 2000s, but it was mostly, former underground pot dealers who are now above ground pot dealers who had, small shops that catered to 50 or 100 people, or in some cases, in the Bay Area, a few thousand people. The difference was after 2012, after the first, the Ogden memo at the time, who was the Deputy Attorney General at the time, and this is the first memo from the federal government that kind of sort of gave the green light to commercialization, at least gave the green light to the medical marijuana industry. And that was more than the development of an industry, it was more of a coalescence, right? It was more all of these diverse and varied interests kind of all coming together and growing in that sense, and consolidating. To the question of whether it influenced the work that I did, I think there's sort of a chicken and egg problem, or a chicken and egg issue. I think most of the people who feel that there should be, a commercial industry, who have relatively libertarian perspectives on, economic issues and business issues felt that way before the Ogden memo or before commercialization and feel that way now. So it's not so much that, this industry came up and then bought off policymakers within the movement, and the industry, took over their views and changed the work that they were doing. It was just that, this is how a lot of those folks, thought things should progress anyway, and this is now the opportunity for that to happen. I do, however, think that, there needs to be a space for people in, the public health advocacy community, people who don't necessarily hold, pro-business views, but, are care more about, the way that policy develops to do that work. And it's, as Keith said, it's very, very hard to do that when you can't afford to get into the same fundraisers and, make the same contributions and have the same sway with policymakers at the legislative level, or you can't fund. It takes at least shoestring $10 million to run a ballot initiative in California. Realistically, a lot more than that. And I don't know anybody in the public health sector in this community, who has the wallet to do that.
Can I chip in, Boris? I think learning lessons from alcohol and tobacco, I think that there are two key risks that you need to mitigate against. Clearly there are others, but I think the lobbying of industry is one, and I think you talked about some of that, and there's been other conversations during the day about that. And the other one is about marketing and advertising and branding, which is very much designed to increase use and maximise profit, or initiate new use. Now that's understandable for a profit-led entity, but it's not good from a public health perspective. And clearly there is this tension between the interests of public health and commerce. They're not completely incompatible though. From those lessons you need to decide which bits of the industry need to be regulated more than others. And for me, marketing and branding and so on is an obvious place to start. I have no intrinsic problem with commercial entities operating in the market. Commercial entities do operate within the market in the Uruguay model. They both grow cannabis and sell cannabis, but there is a structure that limits their activity within very strict parameters.
And effectively
to prioritise public health. And if there was an argument, one of the things that came up today was about the substitution between cannabis and alcohol. Now, if it became very clear that increasing cannabis use had a dramatic impact on reducing alcohol use, and actually there was a net public health gain, then you could make a strong argument that advertising would be a good thing, because you would actually, increasing cannabis use would lead to a healthier society, which sounds kind of weird to say, but it might well be the case. And I would certainly advocate that, for example, with e-cigarettes. Increasing e-cigarette use really reduces the number. If people are moving from normal cigarettes to e-cigarettes, there's a good case for allowing advertising to encourage more people to use e-cigarettes if you have this displacement effect. So I'm a pragmatist about these things. Not that I'm opposed to commerce or people getting rich. That's going to happen anyway. But it's about prioritising the interests of public health over commerce as we move forward in our design and implementation.
Keith, I know you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this also is important to think about internationally. And corporations are relatively powerful in the United States. If you go to Europe, you don't see pharmaceutical ads on TV because you're not allowed to have them. But here, it's protected speech. We do have a campaign system that rewards certainly wealth disproportionate to other nations. So it may be the kinds of models that a lot of us prefer, easier to do in Uruguay or in the Netherlands than they're going to be in the United States. So think about that and then think about globalization. Will it matter? Will big U.S. companies grow and end up dominating those other countries, as they have in tobacco, by the way? We certainly just crushed a lot of controls on tobacco around the world. So it may be that what happens here ends up being what the world gets, whether it wants it or not.
There's a question from the audience that I'd like to direct to you, Alex.
I'd love to speak to this as well as that. So this is definitely the capitalist hat. It's very, very frustrating to me when I continue to hear people say, well, this industry, because it's a sin or it's a temptation, so we're going to treat it completely differently than any other commodity, any other consumer good. We're essentially talking about much larger issues of our society, particularly American society, of capitalism, consumerism, corporatism, and the simple fact of the frustration of our general large group of our society in the United States is not for this anymore. Now, if we want to have a conversation about, revamping capitalism, I'm for it. But to say that my company and my industry is going to get treated completely differently when we are not seeing an increasing health risk as opposed to alcohol or tobacco, I just don't think it's honest and appropriate. I think we need to, if we want to do campaign finance reform, let's do campaign finance reform.
Well, just because I'm pretty confident that Keith will have a response to that. I do want to get to you, Dan, but because I imagine, I guess, the reason people talk about alcohol and tobacco is because, these are, if you think about what profit-seeking firms do best, it does seem that alcohol and tobacco raise some particular questions, so I kind of wonder if
so this may be the disagreement that you were looking for.
I was trying to find one.
There's a really good book about alcohol called No Ordinary Commodity, and it makes the point that certain products, the normal free market mechanisms work differently because they change human judgment, and psychoactive drugs are in there. So I would say, cannabis, whether it's as bad as alcohol or it's not, I would say it is not broccoli.
What about corn? What about corn syrup? What about the commoditization of that and subsidization of that and soy and the mass fillers associated in our food system?
Just let me ask you, but would you regulate it? Do you see any difference between cannabis and broccoli?
I see massive differences.
Okay, but in terms of how risk, they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm growing broccoli in my.
Well, you guys, I think we've done actually a very good job of kind of highlighting this difference. I don't think we're necessarily going to settle it right now, but this has been very, very helpful. So Dan, I know you want to get in here.
I was just going to follow up on that point. Just very briefly, I think people who know me and my politics often say, well, you just favor the non-commercial or the state monopoly model because you're a lefty, and that's true. I will confess to being a lefty, but I will also readily admit that private markets can outperform the government. That I've been to the DMV. I know that the markets can out-innovate. They're more efficient. They're more innovative. But we're talking about selling drugs here. We don't necessarily want or need the most innovative and efficient way to sell drugs. If anything, we're looking for a less innovative, less efficient way to do that.
So we have a bunch of really good questions from the audience, so I just want to kind of ask you guys and hopefully get
Interrupted you on that.
Oh, no. Well, I'm just going to skip you now. I'm going to punish you for your kind of that. So look, it's the moderator's prerogative. That's what happens. We run a tight ship here. So Steve, I wanted to ask you about the lessons you've learned about building kind of markets around cannabis in Uruguay, and also some of the policy recommendations you made in the UK and elsewhere, and how we might start applying this to other illicits like cocaine, heroin, and psychedelics. These are all obviously very different, but of course, I imagine Transform has done some thinking, kind of over the frontier. So if you could share some thoughts on that, and also just on what you've seen in a comparative context, kind of looking to other jurisdictions, other countries, some of the lessons learned.
Well, I'm glad you raised that because cannabis isn't the only drug where there is a debate around legalization and regulation. Obviously, it's very much to the fore, it's very much leading the debate, but the same logic for me for legalizing and regulating cannabis from a public health perspective does actually apply to many other drugs. Not necessarily all drugs, but certainly most drugs that are in popular use because
you don't see cannabis as totally unique, and that
it's unique in terms of its risk profile and the extensiveness of its use and its ease of production. It is and its kind of cultural penetration. But the logic that for any drug, regardless of how harmful it is, it will be more harmful, or there will be more health and social harms if you prohibit it than if you regulate it responsibly, I think applies more broadly. So cocaine, I would think everyone would agree, is a more risky drug than cannabis, but millions of people use cocaine, and in my view, it would be a safer product if we could regulate cocaine-based products, and we would also address the problems of the cocaine market. Now, how you do that is obviously very challenging. We don't have the Netherlands cocaine market to draw on, and so it's a much more challenging question. We have written about it. I think a lot of the same logic applies. You just look at what your options are and make sensible suggestions on which is going to deliver the best outcomes that you've decided that you want to achieve. It's not that difficult, I don't think. And we do regulate, and of course we do regulate things like injectable heroin, countries like Switzerland prescribe it through a medical regulation system. There are also, there's a very interesting regulation model in New Zealand for regulating novel psychoactive substances. It's not actually being used, it's on the books but not being used yet, but it's very much along the lines of Transform's blueprint, you know, asking the same questions and exploring the same menu of regulatory tools. The logic is to find the optimum model that delivers the best outcomes. And for me, that same logic will apply much more broadly than just to cannabis.
Keith, you are on a commission of the great and the good in California, and I wonder if there's thinking among that group of policymakers who've been pretty far-sighted and have been pretty kind of ambitious about cannabis, if they've been thinking about any other illicit narcotics.
Certainly, a number of the people in the commission would. I don't want to speak for them, you know, and
This is a serious conversation that's happening. People are thinking about it.
Some, but you know, there's a very nice. I think I might see Herman Lopez out there. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I would recommend the piece he did for Vox on American attitudes about drugs and legalization, which really striking. You see, cannabis has grown and grown and grown till now most Americans are in favor of legalizing it, but everything else is right down there. You know, about as popular as, you know, getting the flu. I mean, you know, I can't remember the numbers, but maybe 8-10% or something. There's a generalizability in the minds of activists that is not present in the minds of the American voter. So to the extent that you think this is at least in part about democracy and about legitimacy, that you know, even if you're very, very anti-cannabis, you just think when that many people in a democratic republic think something, we should look at the law. It doesn't follow for the other drugs. There's zero constituency there, pretty strong opposition.
Alex, I have a question for you. So you talked about how in Washington State you have this funny situation where you have the emergence of legitimate enterprises like your own that are still competing with a kind of black market sector. Now, my understanding of the debates around legal access is that to some degree you're trying to actually shrink that black market. You're not necessarily going to shrink it to zero, but you're going to try to do that. And it sounds to me as though you're telling us that, you know, the current legal regime is not actually doing that great a job. But also, Dan earlier on raised the fact that, you know, in California, one concern is, hey, you know, what about the grassroots entrepreneurship of people in underserved minority communities, et cetera, who've borne the brunt of the drug war, who kind of want to participate in it as it becomes a real meaningful industry? Do you see any way to help take people who had been illicit entrepreneurs in this space to being licit? It's a question from the audience, and I kind of wonder what you think about that, just as on a practical basis, given your experience as an entrepreneur in this system.
So I'd say, very particular to that, that's a strong kudos to Washington State and Liquor and Cannabis Board. What they did, they actually they did allow for felonies that were associated to cultivation or distribution of cannabis. So that was a really strong step forward to say, look, if you have been a victim of the drug war, we're not going to remove you from your ability to participate in this system. And that also brings up a point I wanted to make earlier in regards to, do we start really tight, do we start really loose, and what's the goal and what's the first measure of action is to get rid of the illicit market. And that should be the focus of every single regulatory system, because if we don't put that before anything else, then the illicit market will continue to provide. In my opinion, what the best way to remove the illicit market is to ask the illicit market to participate. And I think that was a very large misstep that we just made with the state bill 5052. We have we're forcing, let's call it forcing, the medical cannabis system into the regulated system is the way we're saying it. But the truth of it is we're killing what we have known as medical cannabis. And there are plenty of bad things associated to our incredibly great marketplace, but a massive misstep, and I think this happened at the legislature level. I think this is a systemic issue that we all participated in, that we did not try and bring in every single person who is engaged in the medical system. No matter how dark gray or light gray it was, we should have brought all of those people in. And there's a lot of people who are supplying the medical market with 10, 20 lights in their garage or basement, and guess what? They're not going to turn them off, period, in a paragraph. Maybe, let's say 50% is going to turn off their cultivation. The other 50% is going to continue to go.
I want to read out a statement. So someone apparently signed, it's not verified, but apparently signed by Rick Garza, the director of the Washington State Liquor Control Board. And the statement reads as follows. Alex, the reason the regulated new marketplace in Washington has struggled is because the medical gray market has operated under no regulation, in effect competing with the legal market without a state license, without advertising restrictions, without payment of taxes, while operating as a commercial business in conflict with the original intent of the Medical Marijuana Initiative of 1998, has little to do with the new regime. That will change July 1st. So I just want to be sure.
So Rick and I have got to have this conversation for many years, and I have a lot of respect
for it. Could be an
for
arm wrestling match.
If we could settle it all that way, it would be, I don't know who would win, I'd be curious. So this is a point where Rick and I, we respectfully disagree. Well, I respectfully disagree.
I just want to be sure that he was able to have his piece. Dan, I'm going to make you put on your kind of policy analyst hat. A big concern with the idea of a very decentralized, non-commercial, very kind of folky, crunchy, bohemian kind of regime is that you still have the potential risk of diversion and of underage use. And I wonder, how would you think about designing a legal regime? This is a question from the audience. How would you think about a legal regime that would help contain those potential threats?
The difference between, or at least the motives behind a commercial regime versus the non-commercial regime, the folks who want to see a nonprofit model, a collective model, as a government monopoly model, is not because they think that it would be more effective, that those entities would card more often, or that, out-of-state tourists would be more or less likely to visit those facilities. I don't think you change anything that way. There's nothing different that you write about the initiative or the legislation. It's more about the motives behind the business operator and their want or desire to expand the market. So I don't think that part of it gets designed any differently. I mean, whether it's you sell to age 19 or over, you sell to age 21 and over. I just don't think that varies from one regime to the other.
So if you have many small actors, there's more need for regulatory inspection when you just have a few. So that raises some cost to regulation.
So there's a trade-off there.
Yeah, there's a trade-off. You get more variety. You also spread the jobs around, which a lot of people certainly consider valuable, but that's a cost to it. Big companies have a huge incentive to be very well paid, because losing the life, if you happen to have 25% of the state's concession, that's so valuable that you're probably going to keep your nose clean.
Keith, you've thought about this more deeply than I have, so I have a question for you, and I actually imagine that Steve would also have some thoughts on this. So one argument I've encountered, and this might be totally off base, is that if you look at the regimes around the regulation of alcohol in the United States post-prohibition and, say, the UK, you see very different markets. For example, in the UK, you have, or my understanding, is a very consolidated market around the sale of alcohol, whereas in the United States, at least for some time, at least until the relatively recent past, you had a highly fragmented market. And the argument I've heard is that has had some meaningful effect on consumption. But does that resonate with your understanding?
Yes, it does. And let me bring it
also like
a point here that Pat Oglesby pointed out to me. At the end of alcohol prohibition, you had dries and you had wets, but you also had dries who wanted to make a deal. In other words, there were a group of people who said, prohibition is ending, let's get as good a deal as we can from public health control. Rockefeller was the prototypic person. And they were able to do things like put state monopolies in a lot of states and force inefficiencies in the industry, like you can't have vertical integration. You've got producers, distributors, and sellers. That raises costs, and is upsetting to business, but they were saying on the other hand that consumption will be lower because costs are higher. And that has been true. The states that have, the more inefficient the business, the less product they sell, the less harms they have. Currently, politically, we don't have anything like that.
Well, just a tiny little side question on that. So I guess one argument one often hears from people who want to, deregulate markets for narcotics, including alcohol, is that we can use taxes. But what you're suggesting, or what it seems that this model is that by enforcing deverticalization, that's something that corporations can't get around. A corporation might be able to say, hey, lower the tax, they could lobby for that. Whereas if you de-verticalize, then actually you're just making the market more fragmented and clungier so that it's actually harder for a bigger firm to emerge.
Yes, and it's more inefficient. There's costs. Now I have to go to a separate company. I have to find a distributor. Then that distributor needs to go to different retailers. And
it shrinks the resources available for lobbying and whatever else.
Right. And so it was intentional. I mean, what Dan said I thought was very articulate. It wasn't designed to be efficient. It was designed intentionally to be inefficient. So it was bad for business, but it was, good if your point of view was you wanted to reduce the amount of alcohol consumption. But I just want to tie this one point. I'm sorry, but that we don't have that in marijuana in the United States. We have people who are for this, and we have people who are against it, but we don't have a constituency of dries who are willing to make a deal. Gavin is to me the only prominent politician I know who said, under certain circumstances, I'm for it. There's not like a dozen senators or dozen Congress people saying, we are the coalition for legalization under a certain set of terms. So that's why most people are being faced with the choice of you can have commercializations or you get nothing.
Steve, I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the issue of policy priorities is something that you were saying. Like you said that your number one priority should be to eliminate the black market. But if you look at with tobacco, for example, tobacco price controls, that may come into conflict with public health concerns. So if you wanted to eliminate the black market for smuggled tobacco, and this has been a challenge in the UK and Europe and I think everywhere, you would lower prices. But if you want, that can then incentivize use. If you want to decentivize use, you increase prices. And as prices have gone up in the UK, the scale of smuggling has increased too. So we now have 25-30% of tobacco in the UK is smuggled. It may be produced legally in the first place, but it's no tax is paid on and so on. So you can actually have a conflict between two priorities, and we would also, I think most of us would support both of those priorities, but you may have to choose one or the other, and it can often be quite a delicate balancing act. And this is one of the challenges that policymakers with cannabis have to face. If getting the balance right between restrictiveness that doesn't lead to huge spikes in use versus not making cannabis so unavailable or expensive that an illegal market is maintained, and it is quite difficult, and it ultimately may come down to which of those two things you want to prioritise the most.
Steve, just to indulge me just for a moment, I am curious about what you think about that analogy to alcohol. I mean, is there kind of a view that the industry in the UK, for example, is excessively verticalized, and that's one thing that has kind of contributed to its effectiveness?
It's historically underregulated. We've got the worst alcohol problem in Europe, pretty much.
And you think that that's to some degree the market structure contributes to that?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because to a certain extent, it may be more. There's cultural variables. It's quite difficult to read too much into what's policy led and what's sort of more to do with broad underlying cultural very cheap pressures. But yeah, alcohol has become it's about a third the price of it was in the post-war era in relative terms. So. But certainly the availability and accessibility, and I would say historical under-regulation of the industry has been a major problem in the UK. And you can see it almost the exact opposite with tobacco, where I think historically it was under-regulated, and that has begun to be redressed. And they have now we're kind of retrofitting a more appropriate regulation model onto the tobacco market, and the public health problems associated with tobacco are dropping rapidly. The use has halved in the last sort of 25 years in the UK. It's obviously very different from cannabis, because with tobacco the health harm is so dramatically greater. But you can show that effective regulation without needing to resort to prohibition can deliver very positive public health outcomes. So this is why I don't buy this idea that legalisation inevitably is some kind of public health disaster.
I want to be sure that Dan gets a chance to weigh in here.
Yeah, no, I was just going to follow up on a point that Keith made. He talks about there being dries and wets and dries who want to make a deal. That's obviously, the people who are opposed to legalization sort of needing to come to grips with, if they see that this is inevitable, which I think most of us in this room think it is, now is the time to extract what you can in terms of compromises. But I think there's another constituency there that can go in the middle, and that's frankly a lot of the people in this room. There's a lot of really, really bright academics in this world who are looking at this from a public health perspective and don't really have a dog in the hunt. They're not, free market libertarians who, are all about the civil rights of marijuana consumers or drug users. They're not moralist prohibitionists who, want to, make sure that drugs remain illegal. They're just looking at it from a public health perspective and saying, what is the best model? But what I often see is, a lot of those academics look down on activists and think, those folks have an ideological bent, and I don't want to be an activist. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of times really good work that you see in these journals just exists in a silo and doesn't get taken to policymakers. There's no point in looking at the data and writing a report if you don't take that report to policymakers and encourage policymakers to make decisions based on that data, based on those findings that you have. So, it's not enough to have a think tank. You also have to have a government relations shop that then takes that work to policymakers.
I have a very crude, unsubtle question for you, Dan. You work in politics in Washington, D.C. You know a lot of lawmakers. You follow these issues closely. And I wonder, is there any ideological valence to this? So I guess the classic view would be that, libertarians have one kind of view and that social conservatives will have another kind of view and what have you. But I kind of wonder if there's some subtleties that story misses, so let me just throw it out there. I imagine that there are not that many people in Congress, let's say, who think all that deeply about these issues we're talking about right now. But to the extent that there are, well, not that deeply about any number of things, I guess Keith was thinking to himself. I will be Keith's thought bubble. But I am curious, who is engaged with this issue, and what does it look like? And what are some of the ideological patterns you notice? Are there people? So Keith mentioned Gavin Newsom, but at the federal level, are there at least people who, in your view, are thinking about it the way that someone like you thinks about it or comes close?
Yeah, I don't want to take anybody out of the closet, but obviously there's a few people who are public about their views on this. On the House side, Earl Blumenauer, Steve Cohen, Dana Rohrabacher are really active on this and think about it. But they're looking at it from their ideological perspective. Members of Congress usually have a very strong perspective or ideological bent that most of their views on most issues comes from. In terms of the constituencies in Congress, I think on the left, most every Democrat supports legalization, thinks marijuana should be regulated in some fashion. Some people more restrictively than other, but everybody's there. Some people still don't vote for it because they come from purple districts and are scared to, but just about everybody feels that way. On the right, there's two different constituencies. There's the folks who see this as this is a drugs issue, and I'm tough on drugs, I'm tough on crime, and so I'm opposed to it. And then there are the libertarians, and or not necessarily libertarians, but federalists who just sort of see this as a state issue. There are some very committed, principled people who oppose legalization, but nevertheless want to end federal prohibition and let this be a state issue.
But on the right, you're not seeing people who take this, let's say, middle ground kind of view.
No, everyone on the right is polar to one side or the other. And what's interesting about that is, we kind of talked earlier about how my views on the issue didn't change, but the environment did. Right now, you see a lot of Democrats and Republicans working together, and the constituency, at least at the federal level, is about half, right? If we had a vote on legalization, I think it'd be about a toss-up 50-50 vote, at least in the House. And in the coalition, voting yes is going to be about 70 or 80% Democrats, and then another 20 or 30% of those Republicans who we talked about, who are either libertarians and federalists. But then when you get down to actually writing the details of policy, how do you regulate the industry, how big should the industry be, should there be an industry, what should the models look like, then they start to disagree.
So question for Alex, this is one of the questions from the audience. Our host, Mark Kleiman, he has this notion that we ought to set prices based on THC content. Does that seem like a kind of sensible measure from your perspective?
I would say it does. It would actually stabilize, in my opinion, an issue we're experiencing in Washington State, which is high potency, low cost. And it's led to kind of some systemic corruption in our labs, as well as our producer-processors, who are doing everything they can to get a high potency result, because that's what's selling in the stores, which is kind of one of my biggest questions for Mark, to understand why are we seeing that? Why are we seeing consumers so focused on a high potency component? And I have my theories. But if we did a price component associated to potency, which is, it's the active ingredient, it's what's causing the psychoactive effect, I think we would see a faster education of consumers. We'd see a faster stabilization of the market because people would make an educated decision because they're forced to do so based on their pocketbook.
I have one very quick question for you as well. So I wonder, this is really kind of random, but I wonder, let's say we had, in this fantasy world, we have like full commercial legalization. Do you believe that it would be big alcohol or big tobacco companies that would come in and dominate the cannabis market? Or do you believe that there would be some new entrant, some new kind of, new cannabis businesses that would arise that would become the dominant players? Just out of curiosity.
So this is a conversation I have a lot. It's a question I get a lot, as well as I have a decent number of investors these days, and that's definitely always their question. So I think it's a when, and it's a part of the how. If we see the same sort of legalization that's happening statewide, which we all agree is commercial and capitalism based, then if that occurs federally, we will 100% see Altria Group come in. Altria Group's ready. Partners of mine have toured their facilities that sit empty, ready to process cannabis. So